You're watching Bloomberg Quint, and we continue to do our run-up to the union budget. Now, during his election campaign in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a promise to the country's youth. He set a target of adding 1 crore jobs every year. Close to 4 years into Modi's tenure, has that promise been met? Well, with a budget and the 2019 elections now approaching, the jobs debate has again picked up. Joining us to talk about that, but also a lot more ahead of the budget, is independent financial consultant Anantha Nageswaran. Sir, very good afternoon to you. We're very thankful that you took the time to join us here on Bloomberg Quint. I am going to start with the jobs debate, although it may or may not be directly related to the budget. But you had an interesting piece in the Mint, which sort of weighs in on the current debate, which has been started by the Ghosh and Ghosh report, which says that jobs are indeed being created. A lot of people have come in and said that that is not consistent with what we feel on the ground, in terms of investment environment, in terms of consumer spending. But your piece takes a more nuanced perspective and says that, it's not entirely unbelievable, the numbers that the Ghosh and Ghosh report have put out.
That's right. I think I would even argue the opposite, that it is consistent with evidence that I have looked at, and that is what I have presented in that report. You mentioned about funding. I think the corporate sector or the formal enterprises are actually able to get funding because the non-banking sources of funding have indeed adequately replaced bank funding in the last couple of years or 3. And therefore, that cannot be held out as an explanation for lack of jobs. And also, when we look at survey evidence, which is what I have used, the RBI's quarterly industrial outlook survey, hiring intentions and hiring by the manufacturing companies that RBI surveys have indeed shown that hiring has picked up. Now, whether they hire directly on their payroll or on the basis of contract hiring, which they then deploy in their firms, it would still count as formal jobs. And also, I have referred to a piece written by Mahesh Nandurkar of CLSA, where they actually looked at 250 large listed enterprises across various sectors, manufacturing to services, and they found that the direct payroll on their roles, direct payroll went up by around 4% each in the last couple of years. So I think this debate has become politicized. So people take their conclusions first and then look for data that validate it. I began on a skeptical note when I saw the report by Ghosh and Ghosh, and therefore I decided to look at the sources myself before I sort of also joined the bandwagon and cast a skeptical eye on their report. But I came out feeling that no, actually they're on the right track, and that's a very good starting point.
Mr. Anantha Nageswaran, this is Harsha joining in this conversation as well. A word about the informal sector. There isn't much being done to sort of give you data or evidence to say that things are improving on the ground. I'm asking you in the context of the impact that demonetization had on the informal economy. Is there anything that you found for jobs or new jobs to be created, or even temporary jobs that would have created in the informal sector? Is there anything that you found that gave you this hope?
Well, I mean, is there anything that we found that the informal sector has actually suffered either? The problem is there is no data, and data come with a huge lag, and therefore each one does their own survey and come up with premeditated conclusions. So I think we have to go back to the analogy of Holmes and Watson. It is a case of the dog that did not bark. If demonetization still remained popular and remains popular with the people whom we think have been the worst affected, then there must be something about this demonetization that probably either did not affect their livelihood as much as we would like to believe that it has, or probably in other ways it has even improved it. We don't know. They could have found their way around the situation that might have opened up new opportunities for them. Let's also not forget that bulk of the informal employment, whether it is informal enterprise or in informal enterprises, bulk of the jobs don't even have a contract. So we outsiders have no real way of knowing whether informal jobs were lost or were added. So it is not going to be the case that we are going to have reasonably good representative solid data to make a clear judgment that the formal jobs were simply replacing informal jobs, or they were on top of it or not. I think until that happens, all of us can continue to live with our own priors. That is what is happening, unfortunately.
Just one more question on this, Dr. Nageswaran, before we move into the bigger picture. So, I guess one of the things that has been said is that, if job creation is so strong or is strong or strong enough, why is it not reflecting in consumer spending, better sort of consumer sentiment, or at least consumer spending? The missing piece there may be wage growth then, right? I mean, the jobs are there, but we don't know what wage growth is looking like.
That is true. I mean, that kind of a conclusion is not inconsistent with what Ghosh and Gosha put out. They didn't say that these are all high-quality jobs paying good wages and also with good insurance and perks, etc. That's one thing. But I would even, in fact, question the underlying premise of your question that consumer spending is lagging. On the contrary, I would argue that India's GDP growth, whatever little we have of it in the last couple of years or three, is driven by government spending and consumer spending. And if you look at bank credit growth, the only segment that seems to be growing is consumer loans, and credit card spending or credit card outstanding balances have been rising even faster than the overall consumer credit growth. So I think if anything, India's household savings rate comprising of financial and physical savings, if anything, it has not really picked up. So I would argue that consumer spending is perhaps rather robust and is one of the pillars supporting real GDP growth. So even that evidence is not contradicting the story on job creation in the formal sector.
Sure. Dr. Nageswaran, let me just switch a little bit towards the budget. We are speaking at a time when growth has started to rebound again. That's a active debate as to whether growth is going to normalize on its own steam or whether the government needs to do something. What camp are you in? Do you think that there is some need to induce demand, push rural economy perhaps, or should we let the economy recover on its own?
I think to sort of give you a very quick answer to that, I would think demand will pick up on its own steam because some of the headwinds, purely because of the base effect, will fade away and there will be a natural momentum. In fact, I would even argue that the government should reserve or keep in reserve its firepower should some of the headwinds which are brewing in the global economy and in the financial market space materialize. That could be either some geopolitical conflict with consequent impact on the global crude oil price, or a major correction in financial and other risky asset space globally, which then brings down sentiment and sort of becomes a headwind for global growth, affecting India's growth as well. In those situations, then the government can step in and step up the spending even during the middle of the year. So for now, having seen growth bottom out in the first quarter of the fiscal year 2017-18, and with GST issues being ironed out, bank recapitalization being undertaken, etc., the government would be advised to let the spontaneous recovery continue to develop on its own steam and hold back on what it can do if the situation warrants.
Okay, I'm going to push the point about jobs once again, Mr. Anantha Nageswaran, and this is, what do you expect the finance minister to do on the jobs front? There is obviously a jobs program that was announced. Would that be bolstered, and would the government go ahead and say, let me go and incentivize the private sector guys to start hiring? Is any of these situations likely?
Yeah. If you had looked at the Mint columns lately by Pramit Bhattacharya and Tardit Kundu on the Indian tax system, one of the things they bring out rather well is Annexure 13, which I think not very widely discussed or debated, is the fact that the revenues foregone coming from accelerated depreciation that we give for companies actually incentivizes the priority for companies to go for capital expenditure over labor hiring. So what about replacing that with accelerated tax reduction for hiring? So I think it's a country which has got a demographic advantage or a demographic challenge to be tackled, and we are incentivizing capital spending. It is important up to a point. We need technology as well. So it's a balancing act, but perhaps we have gone too far on the side of capital. So that is one thing that the government can do. They did begin to 2 budgets ago, I think, by promising to bear a portion of the payroll cost. The salary threshold for the government to step in and bear some of the payroll costs was kept too low to be of any meaningful incentive for hiring. That can be looked at again, and the thresholds increase for companies to avail of government's share of payroll deduction. So these are the 2 things I can think of as the government can do. But third and most important thing is sometimes government should recognize that they may not be able to help, but they can hurt a particular economic cause. So it's more important not to hurt, even if you are not in a position to help, because at the end of the day, private sector hiring is a private sector cost-benefit decision, and that depends on underlying demand conditions. That is only that much you can do. But we don't have to stand in the way, and I think some tax policies may be standing in the way, which is what I think the research I referred to in Mint is pointing out.
Okay. What about revenues as well? You know, if you look at the last numbers on the revenue deficit, it doesn't give you the confidence that the government is backed by strong tax collections, given what GST has done and so on. Where is he going to get the money from? On one hand, there is clamor for tax cuts by corporate India. On the other hand, he's got a large bill to be spending on the rural economy. And if the revenues are not going to be forthcoming, how is he going to tally?
Yeah. No, in my response to your previous question, I did not specifically even say that there should be a need for some tax deduction, except that in the case of capital spending, I simply said you could actually shift some of the reliefs being given for accelerated depreciation and capital investment towards labor, and that can be used partially to even increase the threshold for the government to bear the payroll cost. So it doesn't necessarily require a fresh allocation as much as a rejigging. And also, if you look at the variety of exemptions, and again I would refer you to Annexure 13 of the budget document, if you look at the variety of exemptions being given to corporations and even to individuals, I think there is scope for rationalizing them, and at the same time even being able to lower the tax rates by removing some of them. And I think that is why the great direct tax reform is still awaited. But then of course we know that the indirect tax reform that GST was in the Indian context has been done in a slightly more complicated fashion. So sometimes we end up actually leaving the complexity intact despite labeling them as major reforms. So the important thing is there is room for rationalization, and therefore there is room for redirecting some of the spending without necessarily having to look for additional resources or cutting expenditure. Most of it is kind of non-discretionary from the government's point of view.
Is it important to live up to the commitment to bring down the headline corporate tax rate, sir, for large corporates from 30% to 25%? A lot of people have said it's not even critical at this juncture, and while they may need to live up to their promises, this one can be perhaps kept aside for a little while.
I would disagree that it is not relevant. I would think that it is important. It is a promise made that the corporate tax rate would be lowered to 25% simultaneously with the phasing out or removal of ad hoc exemptions. And I think the government and the finance minister should follow through on that promise. I mean, the Indian tax to GDP ratio is not that low that that we cannot afford to bring down the tax rate. And second, it's a sort of a basic economics 101 error that if you sort of bring down the tax rate, you are going to lower the tax collection. I think some of the zeal with which the tax administration has been pursuing matters in the last 2 years sort of renders the basic logic of economics 101 wrong, which is that you lower the rate and you sort of go after exceptional cases, and that would actually bring up the tax revenues rather than creating an atmosphere of distrust. So I think we need to enable economic activity, see the nominal GDP growth rate pick up, and then be able to derive tax revenue out of that, rather than using the collection machinery in an overzealous manner and also interpreting some of the laws to the detriment of the taxpayers, etc. I think we need to go back to the trust but verify framework that we thought we were getting into post 1991. But since the UPA years, that has sort of gone into reverse, and this government unfortunately hasn't done much to reverse that. It has even reinforced that. I think that needs to change. Then I think, therefore, the answer is yes, the corporate tax rate reduction must happen along with the simplification of exemptions, etc.
While, sir, ensuring that they maintain the fiscal deficit, where do you stand on that? Just a quick last question, because again, there have been two sides saying that don't be too hung up on the second decimal point, but broadly maintain fiscal consolidation.
Again, a simple answer would be yes, I would agree that one need not be extremely fussy about it, but then this answer has a lot of caveats and complexity, so it's a bit difficult to sort of say, one cannot simply say fiscal deficit doesn't matter, because the bond market has given the signal that it is concerned about the fiscal deficit, even though it might have overreacted. And if bond market continues to view government's promises of fiscal discipline with skepticism, then that would itself undermine any attempt to sort of get out of the fiscal straitjacket. So it is important, what do you relax the fiscal straitjacket for, and how limited in scope it will be, both in terms of time and magnitude. Then I think the market will understand. But the problem is this: the government could have phased in the fiscal consolidation since 2014, rather than using the entire oil price crash bonanza to meet the unrealistic fiscal target that the previous government had handed over to it. And they could have used the money to recapitalize the banks, in which case the growth rate might have picked up even better and the tax revenues would have come through right now. So I would argue, on balance, this government has done well, given the situation that they inherited, which was not 4.9% of GDP, but much higher than that. So I would say fiscal consolidation framework should not be abandoned, but a small leeway here and there for appropriate reasons and in a time-bound manner can be done, as long as the bond market is not spooked. If the bond market is not going to get the right message, then I think the government will be better off not experimenting or risking that scenario.
Always a pleasure, Anantha Nageswaran. Many thanks indeed for joining us. Appreciate you joining us and giving us your views. Anantha Nageswaran,
thank you, Harsha. You're welcome.
Joining us from our studios in Singapore.